What's going on, everybody? Good morning, good evening, wherever you are and whatever time it is. Welcome back to another video with you, man, Measureaholic. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another faction overview for the Divided Impera overhaul mod for Total War Rome 2 1.2.6 edition of the mod. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we are checking out Epirus. Epirus is probably one of the more unique factions in the game in that they have a very unique starting position with some major decisions to make very early on. Their entire campaign can be ended within the first probably 10 turns, and there's not too many other factions that can say that, or at least are not found in such a unique and difficult position early on. So it's a very fun campaign. Straight off the bat, I highly recommend you check it out. But if you're not entirely sold on playing as Epirus, stick around, enjoy this faction overview, and I'll give you a general overview of the faction and why I think you should play them. And we will also get into some tips later on in the video. A timestamp comment will be posted down below. It's always the pinned comment for these videos, so make sure you check that out. If you do just want to jump ahead and skip to certain parts. Part 3 is where we talk about my overall difficulty rating for the campaign, in addition to any tips and tricks I have for you. Part 2 is where we discuss the military of Epirus or any other faction, and then part 1 is where we talk about the perks and debuffs that the faction receives and just their general campaign starting position itself. But anyway, let's jump on into it. Alrighty, so let's jump on in and look at the buffs and debuffs that Epirus receives. Now, as you can see, we belong to the Dardonna family. That means that we also share these two base perks up here that I'm circling around with Egypt, Bactria, the Seleucids, and Macedon. And so straight off the bat, you can see we have a minus 20% resistance to foreign occupation. Just gives you a little bit more happiness when you do take over new settlements, especially settlements of different cultures. And then you also have the Successor Conflicts perk, which gives you plus 10 morale for all units during battles against Hellenic factions. So that includes all of these other Dardonna factions, and it also includes these factions that are part of the city-state subculture of the Greeks, and any other miscellaneous Greek factions that there are. If they have Hellenic underneath their faction name, you will have a bonus against them. So it's helpful because as Epirus, you will be fighting a lot of Greeks. We will get into the details very soon, but straight off the bat, you can see you're on the edge of Greece right here. All of your east is dominated by Greeks, and there is even some Greek factions to your west and to your south, so you're almost surrounded by them, so it will be helpful in the long run. Furthermore though, let's look at the buffs and debuffs specific to Epirus. So these ones down here, where I'm circling around, these are the ones that only Epirus receives. You have the Guardians of Dardonna perk, which gives you public order bonuses from Hellenic culture. The more Hellenic a city or a province is, then the higher the public order will be. Pretty easy public order bonus. Definitely good, but not amazing. It's a fairly generic kind of perk, but it's still going to be helpful in your campaigns, especially while you're focusing on fighting Greeks early on. Then you have the Village Confederation perk, which is increased wealth from towns. Any kind of increased wealth is always going to be helpful, especially the early game. The majority of factions start off in a difficult position economically. At least the majority do. There are quite a few exceptions, but those are for different faction overviews and whatnot. Perhaps a video in itself where I could talk about the economies of factions. But any extra money is always a welcome addition. However, you do have the Hellenic Mistrust debuff. Note it is shown as a debuff because it's written in red. Red is always bad, right? But anyway, you have a major diplomatic penalty with all Hellenic factions, which at the end of the day, I don't think really matters all that much. You're going to be fighting Greeks for the majority of your early game anyway, and your army will outclass not all of them, but quite a few of them. So while it does mean that you can't really ally yourself with many Hellenic factions, generally speaking, there is some opportunity for it, especially if you put in a little bit of money. This by no means does not mean that you cannot ally with Hellenic factions. You just might find it a little bit more difficult, and generally you'll be guided to going to war with them instead. However, ladies and gentlemen, that's it for the buffs and debuffs. Now let's jump into the part 1 section of this video where we look at the actual campaign of Epirus. Let's do it. Alrighty, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the part 1 section of this video where we're going to check out the campaign situation on the grand campaign that is for Epirus. So immediately we can see that we have 2 settlements. You have Apollonia in the province of Macedonia, and then in Italia you have the city of Thorax. These are your only 2 settlements, and you will note they are not connected in that they are not in the same province, which is a pretty big issue for you early on, and it's not an issue that many other factions have to deal with, which is why I said earlier that they're in such a unique position. You will note that you do have a small army in each settlement. Apollonia has a general and 2 units, and in Thorax over here we have another army led by your Basileus Epirus himself of Epirus. You have the general's bodyguard unit, and then you have 3 other units. You have a good bronze shield pikeman unit, which is a very good pike unit that you get access to. Use it wisely, it's actually quite heavily armored. Then you have Syrian mercenary elephants, which is very useful. They are, however, very, very expensive. You can see here their upkeep is at 786. Straight off the bat, there's a massive amount of your income. You will not get many of these in the early game at least, so be careful with that. And then you just have some generic slingers. So you have these 2 armies. You have an administrator here, or a governor, which is kind of interesting. Not too many factions start off with a governor instead of having a spy. Most start with just their starting army and a spy next to them. And then in addition, down here to the southwest, you have your spy up here in Cyrissa, but you also have a navy. Your navy is pretty small. You only have your admiral and then 2 other small ships with him. However, it's still noteworthy that you actually have a navy. A lot of the factions that you can choose to play as usually just have like 1 general with a unit or 2. Some don't have any general at all. But Epirus is a little bit more unique in that it actually has 3 different military forces at the beginning of the game, which is even more unique because you only have 2 settlements. For example, Carthage, it would be a little bit more understandable since they have so many cities over here in the west. But yeah, it's a little bit unique. And like I said, your spy is actually up here in Cyrissa, but you also have a governor backing your capital city of Apollonia. So now, obviously, your kingdom is split into 2. Which makes your starting position incredibly unique. This is definitely one of the more faster paced campaigns, at least for the early to mid game. Once you get to the late game, it generally becomes a bit of a steamroll because your armies are pretty much really good. However, you really need to work your butt off to get there. And one of the things that you need to do, in my opinion, in order to get to the late game, is make a decision based out of 3 options. First off, you have the option to do what Epirus did historically. He left Italia, he left a small garrison in Taurus, and then he came down into Greece, and then fought fellow Greeks, ended up dying down here. You could follow in his footsteps, and you could try to make Epirus the master of Greece, if you so wish. That's generally the more obvious choice. And like I said, it is probably the more historical one. Just don't let Epirus get killed by a tile from a rooftop. But anyway, option number 2. And then to the west over here, we of course have Italy and all that Italy provides. And if you so wish, you could instead send Epirus up here to the northwest, up into central Italy, and take over Rome itself, and build yourself your own Greek/Italian kingdom and empire eventually, because that's what we all want, right? We all love to build empires, and that's what you could do here. So those are 2 of your options, but I did say 3. And now the 3rd option, in my opinion, is that you could migrate. Now you do have 2 settlements, and generally if you have more than 1 settlement, you don't really want to be migrating. However, I really do emphasize that you consider a migration because of how difficult your starting position is. You have a bunch of juggernauts around you, and it's only made worse due to your diplomacy that you start off with, which we'll get into first. You start off at war with Carthage and Rome, 2 of the biggest juggernauts in the early game, and then you have a defensive alliance with Etruria, aka the Etruscans, which is almost completely irrelevant. I wouldn't even bother acknowledging that almost, because they usually get killed within the first 5 turns by Rome, if not the first 2 turns, for the most part. So instantly, it's out of your hands. You're at war with 2 juggernauts in the early game. Rome was famous for pumping out legions non-stop, and they will do that throughout the entire campaign, especially once they hit the Polybian reforms. They are a monster. They're incredibly hard to stop. Good luck with that. And then, of course, you have Carthage down here, which you don't directly border, but you do have Syracuse here that is basically your only border between Italy and Carthaginian possessions. And you already have a navy down here, so the Carthaginians might even try to fight your navy early on if you don't move it back up here to the north quick enough. So instantly, you have 2 very large and powerful factions already at war with you, and there's nothing you can do about it. You have to fight them until you can weasel your way out of it by getting a white peace or paying them for peace or something like that. But at the start of the game, they won't accept a peace straight up, for the most part. Moving forward, though, to your east, you have Macedon. And while admittedly Macedon does only have Pella at the beginning of the game, they are still a potential juggernaut faction. It's generally either Macedon or the Adrian Kingdom here to the northeast that becomes the landowners of Greece. The Adrians take quite a bit longer though, and in my campaigns that I've played, from what I've seen for the most part, Macedon will take most of the territory around them, and then they will usually own at least up to Larissa. Athens and Sparta often get left to their own devices, or they get conquered by Macedon later on in the campaign. But generally speaking, you're in a tough spot. Like I said, you do have 2 cities, but migration is definitely worth considering. But anyway, moving on from that, that's enough of the strategical talk that I'll be giving you regarding the campaign, at least for that part of it. We will look a little bit more at the diplomacy though, because you are surrounded also by Hellenic factions, but you also have some other factions nearby that might be a little bit more sympathetic to your cause. For example, to your north, you have Illyrians. You already have diplomatic ties to the RDA. They are not all that friendly towards you. However, when you encounter a faction of a different culture, generally they will either be neutral towards you or slightly hostile, and that means that you can buy their friendship if you so wish. So you could get trade with them, and then the more Illyrians you start to trade with, the more likely others will be willing to follow in suit up here along the northern coast. So that could be helpful. You do, however, like I said, have an alliance with Etruria, which is almost not even worth mentioning. You can't even get trade with them, so it's almost useless. However, you do have trade with Syracuse.
Welcome,
and you have military access, and you have a non-aggression pact. So clearly, the game is hinting for you to head towards Syracuse and help them out, like Epirus did historically. It's up to you if you do want to follow in his footsteps, but they are basically your one dedicated friend at the beginning of the game. The other small city-states of Greece, though, will be fairly receptive to some sort of relations. Straight up off the bat, Athens is moderate in having a non-aggression pact. Trade is also fairly high with them, but again, this is on normal difficulty that I'm doing this overview on, so keep that in mind. But you will have some options, but don't expect them to be reliable allies at all. Especially Athens. I don't know what it is about them people, man, but every single campaign I get and I ally myself with them, they always throw me out eventually. Don't know what I do. Maybe they just hate everyone and that's just how they are. But far out, Athens just, they suck diplomatically. They always leave me hanging. I don't know what it is. I don't know what I did to Athens, but that's your diplomatic status basically. You have Syracuse as a firm friend. However, you need to get them into an alliance as soon as you can. Etruria is your actual ally, but they'll die in a few turns anyway, so ignore that. And then you have a couple isolated factions around you that might be willing to trade with you, but even though you have that, your economy is still going to be pretty rough at the early game, and even more so due to you having expensive units such as these Syrian mercenary elephants, which are incredible elephants. They will be very useful. You will dominate other Hellenic factions with them and the Romans, but they are super expensive, so be very careful with them. And even then, your other units that you can recruit, even like just mercenaries, are very expensive, but they are very good. They're high quality. But look, straight up off the bat, we're earning 1,500 per turn. Although this is winter and it will improve in spring and summer, that's just really low. So moving from diplomacy to your economy, you are in a rough state early on, but as all factions, you can improve it over time, especially once you start to take over these rich provinces, such as taking over Greece, Macedon, or Italia. Then getting to one of my final points of the campaign section is that your population is going to be a concern. For almost any nation that only has a couple or one settlement, population is always going to be an issue, but for you, it is definitely going to be an issue even after you get a couple more settlements, because your Politides and Eugenes population classes are very limited in number, and that's where you'll be getting some of your more elite units from. So you won't be building your armies out of elites as much as you would like to. The Perioikoi population class is fairly populated though, so that will help you do basic. Here, let's have a look right now. So here is your Greek bronze shield pikemen. They're very good pikemen, but they come from the Politides faction, or social class I should say, and that's 256 per unit, so you're not really going to get a lot of bang for your buck once you start recruiting these. Or you could if you micro them well enough, but I mean, you're going to be using a lot of your population for such a very specific and rigid unit. And then it moves on to your cavalry as well. And even all of these 3 cav that you can recruit at the beginning of the game, they all come from the same social class, which is the Politides social class. Even your basic generic Epirus hoplites, which are good, but they're hoplites. Why would you use a hoplite when you have a pikeman unit? They'll lose almost every single time. But again, they belong to the same social class. Moving on to your Thesbrosian infantry. Sure, I know that pronunciation, but anyway. These blokes also come from the same population class, so that's definitely going to be an issue for you. However, your more generic units, the more Levy style units, come from the Perioikoi faction, and then beyond that you will have some Illyrian units, but they also come from the Perioikoi faction. I believe. We can't recruit any. Oh no, we have the Agrianians. That's what I wanted to talk about. Your Agrianian units, you have some Peltis, and then you also have some Axemen that you can gain access to once you build up your settlement here in Apollonia. And then looking at mercenaries, Politides Barbaroi for the Agrianian sellswords. Barbaroi, Politides Barbaroi. So yeah, you in Apollonia itself, you don't really have a lot of population to work with. Same thing as in Tyrus, although you do have more people there in general, especially in the Politides subclass of your population. It's at 5,000 instead of Apollonia, which is at 3, I believe. Yeah, barely of the 3,000. So Tyrus might be better to try and recruit from, especially if you're going to abandon it. I would say use the crap out of it, recruit as many units as you can, and then get your army over into Greece. Or if you're going to abandon Greece, do it the other way around. Abandon Apollonia, recruit as many people as you can with that population, and then come over to Italy and do your thing. It's up to you what direction you want to go, but be wary that your main battle line units will not entirely be formed out of your good solid battle line units that you want to use, such as Pikemen. You can maybe field 1 or 2 armies with them, but once you use them, they're kind of gone, at least until you start conquering other cities and increasing your population overall. And of course, as a result, use auxiliaries, use mercenaries, and levy units especially to try and make up for this. You're going to really struggle early on to have those solid battle lines of pikemen, especially if you suffer a major defeat against a faction like the Romans. You're really going to struggle to replenish your army. So don't be afraid to use levy units and mercenaries when appropriate. But anyway, ladies and gentlemen, that's it for the campaign overview. You started off in a very unique position. I will talk more about it in the part 3 verdict section of this video, where I'll also give a few more ideas and tips to throw you away regarding it. But now it's time to get into part 2, where we talk about the military of Epirus. Let's do it. Alrighty, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the part 2 section of this video, where we talk about the military of Epirus. First, we're going to check out their navy very quickly, and then we will jump into a long discussion of their military and all of their units that are available to them. But instantly looking at their navy, you can see that you are a melee heavy naval faction. You have a lot of melee ships to choose from, and you also have a lot of ship health behind them. You can recruit ships with as much health as 2000 HP here for your general's unit. You also have some of these other units that start off at 1500 that are more generic units, but they will they can form your main battle line, or they can help support your main battle line. But it looks like, yeah, the highest ship health you get is 2000 with your general's bodyguard, or general's flagship, I should say. So don't be afraid to use that ship in melee. Get him involved, get him fighting. Just be careful of archer fire that can burn down your ships. But like I said, you do have a lot of melee options, and you start off, well, you don't start off, but you end with 160 men on your most expensive main battle line ship that you can get, which is quite a lot. After that, it goes down to 140, 120, 80, 60, and then 60. So you do have options. You can do a lot of small little ships if you want, with only an 80 man crew or even 60, or you can try to do a smaller navy but have larger ships with a lot more men on board and a lot more ship health. It's up to you what direction you want to go. In addition, you do have 2 archer ships that are there to support your melee troops. However, you do only have 501 as the maximum ship health for your skirmishing ships, so don't get them into ramming if you can avoid it. Avoid it as much as possible. Have them be purely just support units to target the other enemy skirmisher ships, or to have them focus fire on threatening ships to your navy, such as firepot ships, or maybe perhaps the enemy admiral's flagship. Then you also have a a ballista on a ship. So you do have some artillery as an option if you do want to do amphibious assaults. And then you have 3 different flagships that you can use. I'm trying not to say bodyguards. I guess it is kind of the same thing. But you have 3 different flagships to choose from. You have the 2000 ship health melee unit that has 180 men in it, which is very useful, very powerful, but I'm sure it will be quite expensive. Moving down from that, you have 880 for your next ship health, and you also have 140 men stationed on that ship. And then you have a small little skirmisher flagship that is available to you with only 80 men on it, but it also does have a small little scorpion on the front of it that will do some damage to the enemy, but not a lot. So very melee focused. Try to ram the enemy as much as possible, or get into melee and board their ships so you can reduce their skirmishing advantage, because you will be outmatched in the skirmishing department if you don't use any mercenaries, which there will be mercenaries available to you since you're very close to Greece, which has some of the best naval units in the game, for example from factions such as Athens. Overall, your navy is fairly solid, just very melee focused, which is not such a bad thing. But anyway, now we will jump on to the military land units of Epirus. Alrighty, ladies and gentlemen, here we are at the military land section of this video for Epirus. That's right, we're checking out the land units of your military, and we're starting off with one of your 3 bodyguard units that you get to choose from. You have 2 cavalry units and 1 spear unit that we won't even bother covering, to be honest. And this unit is probably your most likely contender for a bodyguard that you want to use, because it is a very solid shock cavalry unit. This is your Royal Guard cavalry. As you can see, they look incredibly royal with their very profound deep blue that they have in their capes and whatnot. Very fantastical armor. This is very Alexander the Great-esque in their armor and appearance, so very awesome looking unit in my opinion. And they also have very cool helmets. They have quite a lot of variety as well. You can see the feathers and the different colors involved there. Not really going to cover too much of their statistics, however, the main thing that you need to know is, one, that they are well armored with an armor of 38. That is very good. And they have a charge bonus of 52 and attack of 15. So they are going to be very aggressive, and they will do very well on the charge. But again, as most cavalry is, especially shock cav, do not let them get stuck in a prolonged melee. Their armor will keep them alive for a while, but once they take a lot of damage, they'll start to drop like flies, because they don't really have great melee defense, and they do not have any shields either. So just be wary of that. But charge them into the enemy, charge them back out. They would be fantastic for you early on in the campaign, especially against Romans and whatnot. But before we jump into our skirmishes next, as you can see, we have a friggin' massive roster here. It's very large, and so I'm going to skim over quite a few of these units just to try and reduce the time of this video. And this is going to be a great example. You have Greek archers. Fulfill your most basic need as an archer unit. I'm hoping to have a more detailed video of archers or skirmishes in general coming out soon, so I would highly recommend you check that out once I do release it, talking about the roles of different skirmishes. So that will in itself cover generic units like this, so that would be helpful for you if you aren't sure really on what type of skirmisher is supposed to do what. So keep that in mind. But anyway, we have the most generic Greek archer unit here. It'll be helpful for you because it comes from one of your lower population classes, the Perioikoi. We have generic Greek slingers here. Nothing worthy to note about. They don't have an axe or anything, so their AP damage is down. Some factions do, but this one doesn't. Again, they fulfill the most basic generic slinger role. Then we move on to Greek Javelin men. They're also in the same boat as these other two skirmish units. Nothing really noteworthy to say, except they do have some shielding. And your skirmishers do have shielding, but your archers do not. In fact, most archers don't. There are some that have them on their backs, which do help, but yeah, that's the only thing noteworthy really for your javelin and your Greek slingers, but it's not really all that unique. However, things do change for you when we get to the Peltis section of your army, and Peltis are basically a better version of the javelin, and they come with javelins. That's their primary goal, is to use their javelins to deal damage upon the enemy, so that will help you out. However, as you can see, they have a very large shield, and they actually have some chest armor as well, and they have some decent helmets, so they have, generally speaking, quite good armor. This unit of fairly mid-tier Peltis has an armor of 28, which is definitely nothing to scoff at for a fairly cheap unit. Has a melee attack of 9, which is quite good, melee defense of 12, but most of that's probably due to the shield. Weapon damage of 23, which is okay. Armor pen of 3, which is not very high. But they will be a very useful unit for you when you're dealing with cav-heavy factions or heavily armored factions that you really need to have be hit in the back. For example, Roman legionnaires would be an excellent example. Get them stuck in a frontal attack against your hoplites or pikes. Have your javelin men come around and hit them in the back, and they will deal a lot of damage to them. But your javelins can get stopped fairly easily by shields, so be careful of that. Try to get rear attacks with your javelins, and then try to rear charge these peltis into the rear of enemy units, and they will do quite a bit of damage in melee, so they will be fairly useful in that regard. Moving on, we have some Agriani and Peltus, and as that bloke just yelled, they are actually axemen as well, which is very useful to you. This is one of your more unique units that you get in your roster because, one, they're a javelin unit, which is always helpful, but then they have some decent stats of such as a melee attack of 9, defense of 11, although a lot of that is due to their large shield. They do have only an armor of 8, which isn't horrendous, but it's still quite bad. But the main thing that they have is that armor penetration of 13. So when they have that high armor penetration and that pretty good melee attack of 9, when they do hit an enemy, that enemy will generally die relatively quickly. Not insanely quickly. These guys aren't folksmen, they're not two-handed heavy axemen or anything, but they still are going to be very useful to you. But now we move on to the biggest section of the Epirus army, which is of course your spearmen. And you have a variety of spearmen. I have clumped them all up just so you can see how many spear wielding units you have, but there are quite a few differences here. They're not all just different types of pikes or something. In fact, here is our pikeman that we're going to look at first. You have the Kayodian Guard. This is probably your most elite pikeman unit. If not, it's certainly up there. No, yeah, I would say that is your most elite. Your Thorax bronze shield pikes are fairly close, but they're also a bit more of a frontline battle unit. These Kayodian Guard units, they have a very long pike, indeed. They have a melee attack of 12, defensive 14, armor of 38, weapon damage of 27. Just all around fantastic pikeman unit. They might not go toe to toe against the silver shields or something to that caliber, but they will be very, very close, and they might even beat them if they have a little bit of support. But yeah, those shields will help them for a little bit against enemy slinger fire. But even though they have high armor, they will die to skirmishing over a fairly short period of time. So like all pikemen, they are vulnerable to skirmishers. Be careful with them and don't let them get outflanked by enemy shot cav. But they're a pretty fantastic unit, and as almost all elite units in DEI are, they look fantastic, and there's a lot of diversity. The more elite a unit is, the more diversity that we see usually. So fantastic unit, but you won't be making an army out of them. At least not unless you really try. What you will make an army out of, though, is your Greek bronze shield pikemen. At least initially you will, but they also belong to that warrior class of your society. So if you make an army out of these guys and then you let them die, you're going to struggle to replenish them in the early game. They have fairly low stats compared to your elite unit, though. Melee attack of 9, which still isn't bad. And that's considering you're using a pike as well, which is a very good weapon. Melee defense at 12, weapon damage 25, all fairly solid pikeman stats. The one thing to notice though is that you have an armor of 35. So far, although your most generic basic skirmish units didn't really have any armor, as soon as we got to your mid-tier skirmishers, we had armor. Even your Agrianians had 8 armor, which is fairly good because it's not uncommon for auxiliaries like them to have only 1 armor. And this will be a part of your faction moving forward. Most of your units have decent armor, and since this is one of your main battle line units, them having an armor of 35 is definitely nothing to scoff at, and they have a decent sized shield. It's not amazing, but it's not that bad either. It will cover basically the stomachs or the chest, wherever they're wanting to hold the shield at. So very solid battle line unit if you can use the population to get to them. And then here is the Thorax version of them. They're basically just a slightly better version of them. Once you get your Thorax reforms, which do take quite a while to get to, once you get that reform though, I would recommend you use that unit pretty much at every single possibility you can. Thorax reform units are basically better in every single way. Again, just like the rest of all your pikemen, they look fantastic. They look so incredible. You can really do some nice looking shots. They basically have the armor of legionnaires here with that chainmail too. Just very interesting. Looks very cool. Fantastic. Solid battle line unit if again you have the population for them, but be careful with that. But that is basically it for your pike specific units. You have your Thurio spears. We'll get them out of this little bush if we can.
Yes, Commander.
Not too much to say about them. They're just a solid spear unit. Generally speaking, most Thurio spear units are good at just supporting cavalry. You don't really want them to be in a main battle line formation for you. They don't have any abilities that help them hold the line, such as a shield wall. They're basically mobile cav killers. Use them to support your cavalry when you can. And they have 1 javelin to throw before they get in melee. One thing that is noteworthy though is that they have 300 men in their company, which is quite useful. 300 men is definitely going to be better than the generic 200 that a lot of these other units will have. Solid, generic, but still solid Thurio spear unit. It's basically a good, perfect, it's a perfect example of a mid-tier spear unit. Then you have your Thorax Spearmen. You do have the discipline formation ability, and you have a hollowed square. These guys are basically slightly better than the Thurios pretty much across the board statistically. However, Except for one thing, they only have 200 men compared to 300 for the Thurios. But they do have the hollowed out square formation, which will help you against cav and flanking infantry. And your discipline formation, though, it improves your stats of morale and defense. However, it makes your unit very tight in its formation, which means it gets easily flanked and wrapped around. Even in a one-on-one with one other unit, this unit will get outflanked if it's in a discipline formation. So be careful of that. But again, you have good armor at 38. And then you have Thurio Spearmen, also have good armor at 20. So we're continuing that trend of having good armor with your good mid-tier units. So that's very, very helpful, worth keeping in mind.
Pikemen, ready for orders.
Then we have your Tarantine White Shields, which is a hoplite unit. Even though they said they're pikemen, they're actually hoplites. And wouldn't you know, they have massive white shields. Very cool looking unit. They even have some decent chest plate here, good helmets, and as a result they have an armor 28 with a massive melee defense of 19. If you're going to use hoplites in your armies, which generally I wouldn't recommend because you could just get good pikemen instead, but if you want to, they do have the phalanx ability, and there will be just a solid good backup hoplite unit for you if you can't access your other hoplite units. Which, speaking of which, we'll now move on to your Everett hoplite units. They are basically your most generic mid-tier hoplite unit that you get access to. They have the same armor as that of the white shields, but the white shields do have slightly better statistics for other things, mainly regarding their skill. They have slightly more attack, more defense, more charge bonus, and more bonuses versus cavalry and elephants. So if you can, get the white shields over them, but it's not going to be a massive game changer for you. They'll still hold a line just like any generic hoplite would. Moving on again very quickly, we have some Everett light hoplites. I really wouldn't recommend these guys. They're basically going to fill up holes in your army and be a garrison force for cities that you're trying to defend. Beyond that, do not recommend them at all, really. They don't even have 300 men, which you might hope for in a unit that doesn't have a phalanx ability. Their melee defense isn't bad though, so they're not useless. This isn't necessarily a Levy unit, but it's barely a step up from a Levy, which is why it is labeled as the Everett light hoplite, not a Levy hoplite necessarily. That comes next with your Levy hoplite unit right here. However, you will notice you actually do have the phalanx ability with this Levy hoplite unit. So even though its skill is pretty low, armor is non-existent really, except the helmet. They do have a large shield, solid spear like any hoplite does, but the stats are pretty poor, as is the morale.
Spearmen!
And then you have Everett Spearmen. These aren't as good as your Thurio Spearmen. They're basically a step down, but they're also not just generic levies. They're kind of half a step up from that. They're basically very similar to your Everett light hoplites that you have. Not levy units, but just a step up above them. The skills aren't really all that good. They have an armor of 8 apparently, but they do have a large shield, but they have no formation abilities. They do have one single javelin that they can throw though, and they have a bonus versus cav. So they will basically perform the same role as a Thurio spear unit. They'll just do it nowhere near as good as the Thurio spears will, and they'll be a lot more weaker since they don't have armor. However, that is basically half of the army done now. That's all of your spearmen that you have access to. Of course, you have auxiliaries and mercenaries, which you can use to fill up your lines. And like I said before, be careful of your population that you use up. But anyway, moving on to your melee units or your sword and axeman units.
We await your command.
Here we have our Thurio Swordsmen. They're basically like your Thurio spears in that they are the perfect example of a mid-tier unit. They will be helpful to you to some degree, and in the most latest patch they have slightly more aggressive stats, so they will be basically a little bit more favorable to being an outflanking unit. Keep these units on your left and right hand flanks. They're not really a good battle line unit. They do apparently again have an armor of 15, despite me not seeing any armor on them at all. Perhaps their models need to be up. Oh no, there is some units that have armor. I'm wrong in that regard on this one. They do have some chest plate happening. And they have some decent shields, but still, I wouldn't use them as a main battle line unit. Try to use them just as a flanking force if possible. And they have one javelin unit. But beyond that, not really too much else to say. They have no armor penetration really, only at 3. So a generic, good mid-tier swordsman unit. And when I say generic, it doesn't mean necessarily bad. It just means there isn't really a lot to talk about with it. It fulfills its role, and its role is that of a mid-tier swordsman unit that you use to outflank the enemy. You can plug a hole in your battle line with it if you have to, but it's better if you use a more specialized unit.
Forex
For example,
Swordsmen!
your Vesperosian Thorax Infantry or your Forex Swordsmen here, they are very specialized. They have an armor of 38. Very impressive for a sword unit. Melee attack of 11, defense of 17, although a lot of that is due to their massive shield, but it's still great. Weapon damage of 27. Armor penetration is only 3 though, which is a bit of a shame. Bonus versus infantry of 2, which isn't that dramatic. But yeah, these guys are basically a more specialized swordsman unit that you get access to. They look very cool, have a nice purple or deep blue. It's kind of hard to say if that's a purple or deep blue. I would say it's a deep blue, but depending on your monitor settings, you could almost argue it's purple. Or maybe there is like a blue here and a purple there. Anyway, it doesn't matter. They look fantastic. They're a good elite swordsman unit that you get. They're not the most elite of swords though, and when you do send them up against other factions that actually have dedicated elite swordsmen, they will lose against them, but they will take a lot of enemies with them. They have very good stats regardless. So yeah, they're going to be a good swordsman unit. I would call them elite, but they're definitely not like world-class elite. They're just a good, again, a good staple of an elite swordsman unit, but they're not of the highest caliber, nowhere near in fact.
Yours to command.
Then we move on to the Vesperosian Infantry, which is basically a step down from the swordsman that we just looked at. However, this unit has a very high melee attack of 17, which basically means that they have a very high chance of hitting the enemy when they do try to attack them. However, they have almost no armor penetration again at 2, but their weapon damage is at 32. So it could be argued that this Vesperosian unit is actually better. The only way it isn't better is in morale and armor. Armor on the Thorax version is at 35, and morale is at 49. And then melee defense is higher at 17. But this has a solid melee defense of 14, so your Vesperosian Infantry are definitely nothing to scoff at. This is a very good mid-swordsman unit. It's almost borderline elite. I would say that's even just like a good high-tier swordsman unit. Kind of have low, mid-tier, high, and then elites above them. I would still keep the Thorax Swordsmen and being elites, but these guys are very helpful and they're very aggressive. Very good unit. They do only have 200 men in per unit, but so do the Forex version, so it's not the end of the world that it's only 200 men, but still very good swordsman unit. Very good. And again, you have armor, which is going to be very helpful.
Levy!
Moving on from that, you do have your Levy unit here. I wouldn't mention this unit too much, except for it does have an armor penetration of 12 due to them using axes, I believe. So they have a combination of swords and axes, but because they have axes, it just gives you the armor pen of an axe, which is at 12. The rest of their skills are quite low, but that armor pen will mean that they will do damage to armored units when they do finally make a hit. So you can use them to swarm, say, heavily armored phalanx units or roaming units. Not useless, but they are Levy units. What you can try to rely on though, and I would rely on them, is the Agrianian Assault Infantry. These are one of your more specialized units in that they are very aggressive and they have a very good armor penetration of 14. Melee attack of 11, so they're going to hit the enemy quite often. Melee defense of 12 with a large shield in conjunction with that, which is a part of that 12, by the way. It's not adding on top of it, it's just a part of it. You can hover over the words and it will tell you shield value is at 7. Weapon damage of 19, which is slightly lower than what you would hope for, but this isn't an elite unit, it's just a more specialized unit. So combining that weapon damage with armor penetration, they do have a very solid potential for damage. And then on top of that, they have an armor of 20, like a lot of your other swordsman units do. base morale of 49, which is pretty excellent to be honest. Speed of 3. Just a very good specialized unit for you, and once again, looking very, very nice indeed. They have a bit of a white and blue theme going on with some deeper reds mixed in. Very cool helmets on top. These guys are very brave, very aggressive. They will get a lot of kills for you. Try to have them outflank the enemy or go up against lower tier enemies so they can punch through the enemy's battle line and flank around and wheel around and hit the enemies in the rear. But anyway, that's all of your infantry. Now we're moving on to our cavalry.
Ready for orders.
Here you have Greek Javelin Cav, the most generic kind of Cav. Nothing at all to say about them except they do the basic purpose of being a Javelin Cav unit.
Tarantine Cavalry.
However, you then jump all the way up to your Tarantine Cavalry. Now, I'm not entirely sure what it is, to be honest. There's a lot of things about them that are fantastic, but somehow this is one of the most useful skirmisher Cav units in the game. The only rival that I would know of off the top of my head would be the Numidian Cavalry from North Africa. But these guys have better armor at 23, so if you set them in a one-on-one, they would probably come out on top. But these guys are just generally very skilled. Melee attack of 11, defense of 10, weapon damage of 31, which is very high, so they will get a lot of kills in if you let them get stuck in a melee fight. The only thing that they're struggling in is a charge bonus of 36, which isn't bad at all. It just means that they don't do everything perfectly. They're not going to be very good at rear charging into the enemy and getting kills. They will just do morale damage to them. But they're probably one of the most useful Cav units to you because they're a skirmish unit, but they also act as a very good melee Cav unit. But you do have good melee options here, which we'll see in a second.
Cavalry, missiles
We have
ready.
Thurio Cavalry, basically generic Greek Thurio Cav. Not really a lot to say about them except they're just a solid mid-tier unit, but statistically the Tarantines have better armor, but worse morale and higher missile damage, higher range, but they have lower melee defense, so it's hard. I mean, I would say the Tarantines are better just because of that armor, but the morale is lower, so you do need to be careful of that. Oh wait, no, the morale of the Tarantines is higher, as is their armor. Yeah, the melee defense is what the Thurios have over them. That's the main thing. Okay, but yeah, I would say Tarantines are definitely better than these guys. Are just generic Greek skirmisher Cav, but they are a step up from that first Greek Javelin Cav we were looking at. Basically a solid mid-tier option for you. But that's it for your skirmisher Cav. Very good options available, and they cover your low to mid-tier needs. However, we now move on to your melee cavalry units. These are units that are generally dedicated to being a melee unit, but as a little caveat for every single Cav faction, for every single Cav unit in the game, any unit that is on horseback can generally be used for the role of shock cavalry. Just by dealing morale damage by charging the enemy in the rear. Moving on though, we have
Citizen Cavalry.
the Everett Citizen Cav. Not really too much to say about these guys other than they're just a very solid mid-tier melee cavalry unit. They have good armor at 31, melee attack of 8, defense of 13, charge bonus of 44, which is not bad at all, and they have a weapon damage of 26 and a speed of 7, almost a speed of 8. So just a very good melee cavalry unit. Use them when you can if you can't get your Tarantines instead. Even though they do have some better stats than the Tarantines do have Javelins, which will get them a lot of free kills. So it's up to you which one you would prefer. Although they do seem to have the same amount of speed. Solid melee cav though.
Ready for orders.
Everett Forex Cavalry. Basically just a step up in pretty much every single way from your Citizen Cav. Yep, just double checking stats now. Yep, every single way these guys are better than that melee cavalry unit, and they should be because they're a 4X version, so you won't get them until towards the mid to late game. since they are a Forex reform unit. Again, looking just tremendous. Like, oh wow, look at the patterns on the shields, the colors, the variety in all of these units here. Very nice looking, and they're a very solid melee cavalry unit. Use them to deal with enemy skirmisher cav. They will kill them if you can chase them down, but some of your skirmishers that you go up against will be able to outrun you, especially when you go up against Carthage, which has fantastic skirmisher cav. So be wary of them.
Companion cavalry.
And then we get into the Royal Heavy Cavalry. This is one of your other General's Bodyguard units. They're almost the same as the Thorax units, except they're slower. They have less morale at 38. And more, I mean, they have less armor, I should say, at 38. But more morale at 52. But they're slower, which is funny because they have less armor. So I'm not sure why you would get this unit over this Forex Cav unit, except that it's a bodyguard unit, and so you should be able to get it fairly early on, whereas your Forex unit you'll have to wait a while. But I would easily, any day of the week, get a Royal Guard shock unit over this melee equivalent. Shock cavalry is almost always going to be more useful than melee cav, at least for the most part. But yeah, not really sure why you would get this over your other General's Bodyguard unit. But again, they do look fantastic, so I would recommend you recruit at least one into your armies just so you can see it get into action. Just, oh man. I know that I say the same thing a lot about these units, but they're just so well detailed and they really deserve the appreciation, so. Just really fantastic. I swear one day I'm going to do a video for DEI just talking about the looks of the units, and maybe we'll even do like some sort of top 5 video where we can talk about the best looking units. That would be a hard video to do. It's very subjective, but I'm gonna do it one day. Don't you worry. But that's it for your melee cav. You do have some decent options here, just like your skirmisher cav. However,
Heavy cavalry ready and willing.
we get to your shock cavalry, and as you can see, you only have 2 units to choose from besides your General's Bodyguard unit. So we add him in, and then all of a sudden we have 3 different units to choose from. So you have 3, 3, and 3 for your cav, which is very good. However, getting into it, we have the Cyrissa Lancer Cavalry, one of your very early tier shock cav units that you'll be using. They're available to you from the start of the campaign. They have great stats with a charge bonus of 54, melee attack of 13, bonus versus infantry, which always is helpful. But the main attraction, in my opinion, is their speed of 8, which is very fast, which means that they should be able to outrun melee and skirmish units that will be chasing them down, which is very helpful, as that is generally one of the biggest weak links for shock cavalry, at least besides getting stuck in combat. So very useful early game campaign unit for you. Use them as much as you can. That is at least until you start using your General's Bodyguard unit a little bit more often. But if you need it just for your army, besides your General's Bodyguard unit, your Cyrissa Lancers will be fantastic. Then we move on to your Thessalian Cavalry though. And this is where things get a little bit tricky, because your charge bonus goes down. However, your base morale goes up quite a lot, but then your speed goes down as well. So even though your charge bonus gets reduced by quite a bit,
Thessalians!
your Thessalian Cavalry definitely aren't really bad at all, and Thessalian Cavs themselves are generally one of the best horses in the game themselves. But the major thing that your Thessalian Cav have over your Cyrissas is armor, which is undisputable. 28 armor versus 11 armor. That's very substantial. Thessalians will definitely last quite a bit longer when they're going up against enemy skirmishers and they're taking skirmisher fire. So use what you can when you can. The Cyrissas will do the job, but I would suggest that the Thessalian cavalry would be better at doing the role for you. That is, if you can't use your General's Bodyguard unit, which is still fantastic and has higher stats than Thessalian for the most part, but they are slower. Alrighty, ladies and gentlemen, we're almost done with this. Now we'll check out the elephants and then your war dogs.
Armored elephants! elephant!
You have Syrian mercenary elephants. Now I nearly didn't include them here because they are a mercenary elephant unit. However, they are a faction mercenary elephant unit for you. So you don't necessarily have to go to where they're recruitable, which primarily is in Syria, to get them. You actually even start off with one already recruited into your armies at the beginning of the campaign, and as such it will probably be your most useful unit for at least the first 20 to 30, 40 turns in your campaign. Stat for stat, the Syrian mercenary elephant is the best in that it has the most armor, but some of the elephants are bigger than the others, and I'm not too sure if these are bigger than the Indian elephants or if they're the same or not, but I know the African elephants are smallest, so just keep in mind this is a very excellent elephant unit and they will crush blobs of enemy infantry.
Animal handlers ready!
And then you have the Lassian War Dogs, which are available to you very early on in the campaign as well. I've said this a couple times before when we have seen War Dog units. Basically just use them to chase down enemy cavalry or enemy very light units like Slingers or archers that you can't be bothered to send units to chase down. These War Dogs will do it for you and they will pin that unit until you can come in and kill them with something else. They're not amazing at killing things. They will be okay against some cav, but yeah, basically use them to catch faster units that you're struggling to hold down in a battle. But anyway, ladies and gentlemen, that's all we have to say about the military of Epirus. You have a very large roster. Not the biggest in the game, but it's definitely up there with some of the rest of them. Yeah, that's your military for Epirus. Now we will jump into the part 3 section of this video where we'll talk about the difficulty and then some final closing tips and statements from myself. Alrighty, ladies and gentlemen, this will be another quick part 3 section of a video for a faction overview that we'll be doing. I won't take up too much more of your time as I've already taken up plenty. And I feel like I've already stated quite openly what my opinion of Epirus is. Number one, they're a very unique faction. They have a very unique starting position, very unique diplomacy in that you're already declared war on by two of the biggest powers that there are in the early part of the campaign. Your faction itself is unique in that you have a very cool roster. You have very cool AOR units very close by to you, such as some of the best skirmishers in the game. Excellent armor penetrating units from the Thracians and the Illyrians and so on and so forth, the Agrianians. You have a lot of options. You're just in a very cool, unique position, and that's one of the biggest highlights of Epirus. While every faction in DEI and in Rome 2 is unique on its own, some are only just slightly a little bit more different than others. Epirus is one of those standout factions, and it's one of those factions that you'll be able to replay a lot because you can do your campaign in quite a few different ways, and the outcome is almost always going to be different because you're in such a volatile position. Basically, you're in a position where your campaign will be made or broken within your first 20 to 30 turns. If you get into turn 30 and you're still really struggling, chances are you're done. And it kind of depends on why that is. For example, if you're at turn 25 and you're still fighting Rome, but you haven't taken any settlements off them at all, then you're pretty much done because Rome is going to be pumping legions out at you by that time. And it's just a matter of time until they reach your city of Taurus and Apollonia. So again, just to reiterate, your entire campaign will be dominated by how your early game goes. This will be a very micromanagement heavy campaign, and I mean that in not just like your military battles where you need to micromanage every single unit, but you will because you have Pikes, and Pikes do need quite a bit of special attention combined with your shock cav and all of that. But your campaign itself, on the campaign map, you need to micromanage how you're treating other nations, who you want to ally with, who you don't want to, who you want non-aggressions with, etc. You really need to think about your moves that you're making and what your goal is. If you want to take over Greece and forget about Italy and Sicily, try to get peace with Rome and Carthage and do things that both of them will like. Give them money, get relations, declare war on their enemies, help them out in their wars if possible, just to get peace with them. You need to be conscious of those things. If you're quite careless and you can see yourself surrounded by a lot of enemies very, very quickly, and they will come and hunt you down. Rome will cross the Adriatic to come get you. They almost always conquer Epirus in almost any campaign I've ever done. I always see Epirus get wrecked by Rome. It might take them about 40-50 turns, but that's because the AI gets certain auto-resolve benefits. In the majority of my campaigns that I've seen, Rome will come and take over Apollonia, and as such, they will then conquer the rest of Greece after that. So don't think just because you're across the ocean the AI won't pay attention to you. They will, especially once they take Taurus. And that brings me to my final point before we jump to the difficulty level, and that is, if you do want to make this campaign fairly easy, in my opinion the easiest choice to do that is just to rush the crap out of Rome. If you can rush Rome, take over Rome itself, as in their main capital. If you take out the capital, that's their main producing center of legions, then you can also quickly rush the rest of their settlements. If you pull that off, then you basically have the game in your bag. You have a very high quality army, and then you also have great AOR units that are close by, and as long as your units are of this solid quality, you'll be able to outmaneuver and outdo any AI army that comes up against you, because generally speaking, players are smarter than the AI. It's pretty rare for AI to be smarter than the players. AI can get lucky, but they just don't know how to use units like players do, like shock cavalry or elephants, etc. So take over Rome, do it quickly, and this can be quite an easy campaign. However, it's not such an easy thing to do unless you're very familiar with DEI and how battles work and how to min-max things, especially if you're a bit more like me, who's someone who is a bit more casual or a little bit more roleplay stylish. You just enjoy the story you get from campaigns like myself. This can be quite a hard campaign for you. And so if you don't rush Rome, which to be honest I recommend you don't, because then you ruin a lot of the fun. But if you don't rush Rome, then in my opinion this is a difficulty level of a 7 out of 10, which qualifies it as being hard. 6 being above average, 8 being very hard, 7 just being hard. Like I said, you're surrounded by juggernaut factions, and you can get very unlucky and have them all declaring war on you at the same time. You already have half of them at war with you early on, Rome and Carthage, and you're not getting out of those wars too easily. So do keep that in mind. You do have a hard start, and your first 20 to 30 turns will determine if you win or lose. And but ladies and gentlemen, that's pretty much all I have to say about Epirus. Hopefully by now I've convinced you to try them out. If not, perhaps you can comment down below and request for me to deliver a campaign on it. Eventually I'd like to do a campaign of Epirus, as I've never done one before, at least not until its full completion, or have I never uploaded a video about Epirus. So I would love to do some more, but in the meantime, I hope you enjoy your campaigns. Do check out the playlist that I have at the end of this video for you to check out other faction overviews I've done if you haven't checked them out already. I've already done quite a few. I believe this is number 10 in our list, if not number 9. I believe it's number 10. So I hope you enjoy those other faction overviews. Leave suggestions for future factions you'd like to see down below. And then until then, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I shall see you in the next one.